again, reset tool here to reset to the default settings. And we can kind of look through here and see what we have. Before I go into the joint settings, let's look at the bone radius settings, because this is kind of a little bit easy to explain, and it's not really all that important really to change. I typically leave these at the default values, though you might find that you might want to change these. What essentially this is doing is the bone radius of each joint. Let's say if I just click here and click here and click here, and I'll hide the grid. So the size, the actual radius of these circles that make up the joints is set in Maya based on this setting here, the bone radius settings. And they have short bone length, short bone radius, long bone length, and long bone radius. And these are all based on Maya units. So right now, the short bone radius is 0.5 and long bone radius is 2. And what I have here are two long bones. So the radius, the circle that makes up these joints, this radius is 2 units in Maya. If I change that, let's say I make the radius 5 units, and now I create another long bone, you'll notice these circles are much larger now. It's also short bone. If I click a little small bone, you'll notice that the radius is much smaller. If I move this next to the original long bone I had, this short bone radius is 0.5 and this original long bone radius is 2. And then I changed it to 5 here. So the short bone length and long bone length, these are the thresholds you set for when Maya makes this change in the radius. If I make a bone that's 1 unit or less, it uses the short bone radius, and this one is longer than 1 unit. This span, this bone, is longer than 1 unit, so it used the long bone radius. So if I click around, you can see how as I get further away, these joints can change shape quite a bit. And it's kind of, as you can see here, they're kind of proportional. As I click on these joints in different places in the hierarchy, you'll notice how they move. Only the joints below the current one in the hierarchy, or the ones that were created after the current one in this particular case, will move when I move any particular joint. So yeah, that's just using the bone radius settings here to get different sizes for your bones. And you can adjust these to get whatever result you'd like when it comes to making different bone lengths and the radius of the joints in between. It's not really super big deal, but you know, it's there. So I'm just going to delete all this stuff. I'm going to reset my radiuses here to go back to their default values. And let's go back up here to the joint settings. So the first one is degrees of freedom, and by default all 3 degrees, X, Y, and Z axes, are checked. So I'm going to click and click. So now I have 2. So now I have an actual bone. So when I rotate this, you can see the bone swinging around. So I have all 3 axes checked in my degrees of freedom. So rotating in the Y-axis, Z-axis, X-axis, that all works. So let me delete that, make a new one, and let's uncheck the Y-axis, for example. So now when I rotate my Z-axis, that works. X-axis, that works. But Y-axis does not. It does not swing around in the Y-axis. So this joint has been locked in the Y-axis. And you can see that over here in the channel box, the rotate Y channel is gray instead of the usual black color. So this box is grayed out. I can type in a value here, hit enter, and it'll go back to 0. So the degree of freedom for this joint has been constrained on the y-axis. It cannot rotate on the y-axis. And every joint I've made with those settings active are constrained in this way. So let me delete that. Go back to my front view. Let's say I click this one with the y-axis unchecked, and then I'll check y, uncheck z, and click this one. Check z and uncheck x, and click this one. Then I'll check all three and click this one. So while you're creating the skeleton, you can change those settings on the fly. You'll notice as I select the first joint, rotate y is gray. The second joint, rotate z is gray. The third joint, rotate x is gray. And the last joint, none of them are gray. So these degrees of freedom are all different, even though they're in the same joint hierarchy. So rotating z is locked for this one. I can rotate x and y. Meanwhile, this one's rotating x is locked, but y and z both work. This first one, rotate y is locked, but z and x both work. And if you decide later you don't like that, you don't want this to be locked, you can right click on the rotate z channel and you can say unlock selected. And now rotate z works again. So degrees of freedom just simply allows those axes to rotate or not. Second, you have orientation. This can be very important, but typically I leave it at the default values. By default, orientation is X, Y, Z. So when I click, I'm just going to make a kind of zigzag pattern of joints. Hit enter. You'll notice when I select this joint, it flows along the path of the joint's directions. When I click this joint, you see the arrows are flowing in that path. And I am in object mode, by the way. If I go to world mode, it'll constrain the move axis to the world coordinates. But if I go to object mode, which constrains the move axis to the object's orientation, the move handle kind of shifts, so where y is up, but it's up in relation to the direction of the bone. So it's kind of perpendicular. There's a 90-degree angle between the up axis and the direction of the bone. So this is up in relation to this path here. So when I click this joint, y is up, x goes along the joint or along the bone, and z is depth coming in and out toward us in the camera view, since we're looking at it in the front view. So again, y is up, x is along the bone. Click this one, y is up, x is along the bone. Y is up, x is along the bone. And the one at the very end does not have a bone to flow into, so it kind of goes to the world axis. Keep that in mind. Sometimes what I'll do when I create a skeleton, if I know I want the axis to flow at the very end of the skeleton too, like at the wrist, for example, I'll make my shoulder, elbow, wrist, and then I'll create another little bone, hit enter, and I'll select that bone in the end I don't want and delete it. This last joint will still maintain that orientation from when it was created and keep flowing in that direction as opposed to being aligned with the world. But in any case, let's go back to our orientation. So that's using an XYZ orientation. And you'll notice as I mouse over this, little pop-up text pops up, and it's also down here at the bottom in the help line. It says the first letter indicates the axis to point down the bone, and the second letter aligns with the second world axis orientation. So the second axis world orientation is right here in the next pull-down menu, and right now it's plus Y, where Y is up. So positive Y is the second letter in the orientation. If I were to make this positive X, or even let's do negative Y, just make it a little bit easier to see. When I start clicking my zigzag pattern again, hit enter, you see now the y-axis is pointing down, and X is still flowing along the bone. Vast majority of the time I'll keep this at the default values, where up is positive Y and orientation is XYZ. Now, some applications, the up axis is different than positive Y. I think Maya actually is a little bit unique in that positive Y is up. In another application like 3D Studio Max, for example, I believe it is by default positive Z is up. And in other applications that might be the case. So when you're trying to export something from Maya into those applications, you may have to change this type of thing from, instead of being Y up, it's actually X or Z up, I should say. So that's kind of where that comes into play. Most of the time, I think you can keep your orientations the default values and it should work fine. Let me delete both of these. So next we have a couple of check boxes here. We have scale compensate, auto joint limits, and create IK handle. And by default, scale compensate is turned on. So when scale compensate is turned on, when you scale one joint, it won't scale the joints below it in the hierarchy automatically. With scale compensate turned off, they'll all scale whenever you scale the top joint. And then with auto joint limits, let's turn this on. Well, first let's turn this off and create a simple little 3 joint skeleton here, kind of like a leg where you have the thigh, or the hip I should say, the knee, and like the ankle. Hit enter. And then I'll create a kind of a similar one with auto joint limits turned on. I'll click through like this, or have kind of like a leg looking skeleton. So with my first skeleton, when it had a auto joint limits turned off, if I were to rotate, these joints, see, I can rotate them all like this. But if I go to this one and rotate the knee, I cannot rotate it past this position. So it's automatically limited the joint rotation to be aligned with the first joint. So it's like a straight line. While this one, I can rotate it all the way up and around. So if you think of it as someone's leg, when you bend your knee, you cannot bend your knee forward past this position or you'll be hurting yourself. If you think this is your knee, if you bend it like this, you've broken your leg, right? So by creating this little bend in the joint setup, and by having the auto joint limit turned on, we've automatically limited this joint that it can only rotate in the z-axis to this point, and it no longer, and also you'll notice the rotate X and rotate Y are also locked. So I go to my perspective view, rotate X, I can't, rotate Y, I can't. While this one, rotate X, I can, and rotate Y, again, if this is your leg and your leg goes out that way, you've hurt yourself. So if you're rigging a skeleton for a character, sometimes it can be a good idea to turn on auto joint limits when you're dealing with a joint that you know can only bend in a certain way. Now the way that Maya knows how to limit it is by putting this little bend in the joint when you create it. If I just make a straight line and hit enter, so with joints just placed in a straight line like this, you'll notice that none of the rotations are grayed out because it has no indication of how it should be limited. So again, go back to my front view and put a little bend in the joints like this. You'll see now my knee joint is limited with rotate X and Y being grayed out and rotate Z not going beyond that straight line. And then we have create IK handle. If we check this, you'll see a whole new box of options pop up for IK handle settings. And IK handles, I think I should probably cover in a completely separate video because there's a lot of options here for that. But an IK handle essentially will be created within the joints as you make them with that option turned on. If I just click my 3 joints, hit enter, I have an IK handle here, which you can see I can move around like this. And I will have another video covering IK handles in a much more prominent way. But just so you know, you can create an IK handle in the joint, right through the joint tool, instead of going through skeleton IK handle tool and creating an IK handle with this tool instead. Okay, so I think that's essentially, turn those two check boxes off, I think it's essentially the basics of creating a joint. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or comments, if you think I kind of missed anything or didn't cover anything, or didn't cover something the way you'd like, let me know. I can definitely try and fix that. Thanks for watching and commenting and liking and subscribing. I really do appreciate your feedback, and I will talk to you later.